It's easy enough in the chat because some of the cameras are off. If I could just get a bit of a steer as to how much experience people have of sort of designing and delivering scenario tests or crisis exercises, that would be good. Let's go for a kind of a one is none and 10 is high. Then that would be useful. But so if you just shove that in the chat. And what I wanted to do to kind of maximize time for questions really is that we're just going to touch on different types of exercises that there are, different types of impacts to focus on, and the quite hot topics at the moment in the industry, and which areas you should really be trying to focus on during those exercises. And I'll flip between exercise and scenario test quite a bit. Again, in the podcast I did with Helen recently, she asked me the question of what's the difference between a scenario test and a crisis exercise or an exercise, because I use them interchangeably. I think they're really aiming at the same thing. The word test typically is pass or fail, exercise is less so, but there's definitely certain things that we are trying to build into our scenarios now that are a little bit pass fail, especially if we're talking about IT, especially if certain people are setting their objectives up as like, can you assess us on a bit more of a pass fail type of criteria. There's lots of things that we can include. There's different types of exercises, but as I say, I will be flitting between the two. The industry, or the UK financial services industry, has started to term it scenario testing, and I think that's filtering around the world. So scenario testing, scenario exercising sessions, workshops, whatever it may be. So some of the stuff will be familiar to most of you. So if I just quickly share some slides, I'm not going to go overkill on this, but hopefully this is now coming through with a slide here that says scenario testing format on it. So when looking at scenario testing, there's different ranges or different formats to include. And this is something I quite like to use here is based on your team's maturity, i.e. their confidence, their experience in dealing with either live incidents or actually going through a serious program of exercises. So it's the team maturity, whether it's high or low. And then at the bottom there, it's the level of complexity. So actually, how much time do you have? How much effort can you put into it? Typically, the higher the complexity of an exercise, the higher the maturity of a team that you are looking to exercise and test. So we've got a range there from bottom left of plan walkthrough, where you really are maybe working with teams that have just created a new plan and they just want to familiarize themselves with it. Maybe they've got new team members, maybe someone's just joined and they just really want to validate it. It's a bit more of an assurance type exercise, and also an opportunity to spot any gaps. You then got a facilitated team discussion where it's a little bit more doing. There's a discussion around what we would do, what we could do, but I quite like to facilitate the team and get them actually doing a little bit. Maybe that is writing communications if they're going to say they're going to do some communication. If they need to brainstorm some ideas, actually going and getting them to do it. The next step up being a single team simulation. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complex, and for more mature teams, where we want them, again, to do a lot more doing. So responding to phone calls, responding to emails, maybe putting them in front of a camera and doing some media interviews. We just really want them to actually get practicing. I've seen too many clients kind of making it easy for themselves, sitting in a room, or maybe on a virtual call saying, yeah, we would do this, we would do that. And so the single team simulation, I think, is something that we really want to get teams doing. Then goes up from there into the less bold text. So multi-team simulation, same thing, self-explanatory, but you've got multi-teams. So maybe in one room, you've got the IT team that are feeding up into a strategic, maybe a crisis management team. You've got a cyber response team. You might have communications teams. You've all got them dotted around in different rooms, which helps them to practice things like collaboration, handoffs between different teams, how they're going to do it. I was at one client, I was actually at the Bank of England. So I don't know if anyone's been in that building, but it's absolutely massive. And they had their gold team in one room, their silver team on the opposite side of the building. And they quickly realized that they were spending 5 or 10 minutes running between these different rooms. And that was just a simple lesson to learn, that you've got different teams in different rooms, whether virtually or physically, that actually having them in the right place at the right time is a lesson to be learned. Multiple days, again, throwing them over multiple days is quite typical. Get given a leadership team for half a day, maybe a full day, less so over multiple days. But as you could imagine, rarely crises are over and done with within 24 hours. So the ability to stretch them over various days is huge. Maybe you can do the first day on a Friday, come back to them on a Monday. There's huge value in being able to do that. And then live systems or operational testing, which is clearly what the regulators are striving for a little bit more now. Certainly a bit more pass fail type testing. Again, lots of risk assessments probably need to be made there as to whether you take systems offline. Quite often clients might want to do that at a weekend when their operations are less busy. So on the right hand side, I mentioned there around the maturity and complexity. I'll flip down into the types of scenarios. So as business continuity professionals, we'll often talk about impacts rather than the scenarios themselves, and impacting the critical dependencies. So we're talking here in the yellow row there around processes, people, premises, technology, data, and third parties. A lot of that comes out of a business impact analysis or the resource mapping that the regulators are after now. And there's a heap of different scenarios there that are in the table that feel free to screenshot, or I can share this stuff later on anyway. But you've got lots of different options here to start impacting your technology, impacting your data, your third party, etc. I think what I'm seeing at the moment, or certainly past many years, has been around cyber issues and obviously therefore technology and data. But more interestingly, recently, I think there's definitely much more of a focus on something like that happening at a third party. I think the EBA have just released some new guidance on third party risk management today, or certainly this week. It's all about supply chain failure, your suppliers, and you just don't have that ability to have high levels of assurance over them. Your ability to access some of their plans, provide that level of assurance and do audits. So you don't have control, and you therefore avoid some of the commentary internally where you go, well, don't do that scenario because that'll never happen to us. It would happen to a third party and could happen to a third party, and then that would ultimately have the impacts on us. So it's really important to look at third parties as well, not just internally. There's many sources on the right-hand side which you can look at, like actual previous disruptions that have happened, industry-wide incidents that are maybe happening to your competitors or that are in the news. There's intelligence sources, there's the global national risk registers, the World Economic Forum, and then regulatory publications. But what I urge is that the word severe but plausible is again from the regulators, but ultimately serious, believable, realistic, all those things need to happen. Otherwise, you're just going to lose the focus of the team that you are trying to exercise. If it's not challenging enough, they might not learn anything. They might not come back for more. If it's too unrealistic, again, you'll just be met with some commentary and you kind of lose them from the off. So you really want to make sure that it is severe and both plausible. And then finally, before getting to some questions, I think they're relatively straightforward, but you've got an opportunity here where you've got leadership teams in the room. Quite often they'll tell you they don't have the time, but if you can really focus them in on areas like their communications, that's both internal and external communication, with the focus really being on crisis communication here. They might then need access to some PR support, external agencies, how they're going to collaborate in the middle there, some collaboration with different teams. Again, you've got IT teams, gold, silver, bronze teams, heads of departments, whatever you may call them in your various organizations, that all need to come together and work together in a stressed environment. It's very different to business as usual. There's a lot more pressure, time pressure, stress. So giving them an opportunity to practice their collaboration is key. Understanding their roles and responsibilities, I think, speaks for itself. People may not be clear on what happens during times of stress, so give them an opportunity to practice that. Levels of authority is one that is sort of a challenge we come up against quite a lot. Is maybe we're using deputies during the crisis, and actually some people realize that they don't quite have that level of authority to make certain decisions or authorize certain levels of payments if someone is off ill or off on holiday or just simply not around. How you're going to prioritize efforts. So they may have prioritized their functions, departments, activities, or suppliers, whichever way it is. How are you going to prioritize so that your time is not wasted? And then one of the hardest things to do is information gathering and making the right decisions off that. People like to work off paper still, Excel documents, shared files across Microsoft Teams or SharePoint, whatever it may be. It's still becoming more and more difficult to do that. There's lots of tools out there. I'm still yet to see one that works well. And the reason I say that is because this is not business as usual. People typically pick up these tools in a stressed environment. It's not the way they normally work together on a day-to-day basis. So these information gathering tools and communication tools that people use are suddenly not worth the money that's been invested in them. So a few focus areas, there's lots of different areas you can focus on, but there's just a bit of a brief overview of what I think's important for you to relay back to your team. So I'll stop sharing there, but I think I think maybe something that I maybe missed at the beginning is just the importance of it is ultimately you're just not wanting to go headfirst into a crisis, having not practiced it, not knowing who's doing what. There's lots of time that could be lost, money that could be lost, reputations that could be damaged. There's a whole heap of different reasons why you want to go into something having had a practice, a bit of muscle memory. I quite often bang on about it is crises don't often finish after 24 hours. So you need various different people who are trained up to take over from primary role holders so they can step into their shoes, have the right levels of authority, and ultimately crack on and make decisions confidently. So I'll pause there for any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. And it's really interesting when you started talking about the crisis comms, because last month we had someone talking about that, and there's a huge crossover to what you said around, the importance of practicing that as part of these sessions, as well as you were just saying, it's just important to have a conversation where you go through the plan with whatever level of complexity. It's just getting the people around the table and saying, is this going to work? And do we all know who's going to do what, where, when, and how? Because that's what your plan tells you, but it won't work until you do that. Any questions for anyone else?
Yeah, so when I've done exercises with clients in the past, very similar themes of lessons come out of them, communication, team liaison, documentation, etc. Have you got any examples, a bit like the one from the Bank of England, of unusual learnings that you've then carried through to another client to say, it didn't happen here, but somewhere else I've had this experience that you could share?
Yeah, one that stood up was, I think this was relatively unique, was where, I think I mentioned it again in the podcast with Helen, was I was in a scenario where we had huge strikes going on outside the building, staff were unsafe, and everyone just looked towards the CEO. That was our intention as well. Look at the chair will start leading this, head of the crisis management team. And he just squirmed. He wasn't comfortable for about 30 seconds. And then he just put his hand up and he said, you know what? I'm not the right person to lead this. I shouldn't, as the CEO, I don't know enough about security at the front door, people safety, all that stuff. Yes, he was fine and strategic. He'd prioritized the business, etc. So he then handed off to the head of the physical security. And then suddenly the guy, head of physical security, he was thrown into the chair position and he'd not practiced that because all previous scenarios had maybe been around IT or something, and the chair was able to do that. So I think that's something that has come up where the chair has simply been the wrong person based on the situation faced. I'm seeing that a bit more and more now where people are actually trying to put down some high level sort of checklists for different scenarios. They're high risk scenarios, and on those would be different leaders. So not the same leader every time. What is becoming more and more interesting is the liaison and sign off of communications with third parties. I know that in the feedback, yes, we talk about just kind of generically internal and external communication, but actually, if you've got this whole heap of suppliers or third parties or customers, who is the person who's in control of that? And then in the exercise, I go, bang, right, we've worked it all out, send it, then get them practice and realize that all those messages could create heaps of incoming communication again. So the one person who sent it out is then not going to be able to field all the different questions that are coming in, and therefore who signs it. So you're kind of going deeper and deeper into that communication has been quite interesting. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, and actually the last thing you've said there, that kind of resonates with something I've learned from our brand relationship director, in which there was an incident that, something was said about a particular brand, and comms was issued before he'd had the chance to speak to the brand.
Yeah.
And so that's a very unusual, in my experience, connection to an external party, because that is an extremely personal, professional relationship, not just through your external comms team.
Yeah, I had a question. How much value do you see in bringing your third party in on the crisis when designing a crisis scenario test? Actually bringing that third party into that test and essentially doing a multi-channel exercise where they're doing a structured scenario response, disaster response, alongside you invoking them. So essentially you're testing together, because we can internally test all we want and satisfy ourselves that we're fairly okay with our procedures and know what to do. But then if we hand it over to a third party, because we're reliant on their service or application, and they're not aligned or not ready, then that kind of, we're only as good as our weakest link. So how much value do you see in that, in coordinating and designing a scenario test alongside your critical third party as well? I mean, obviously we'll have limited success if it was like Microsoft or Amazon, but if it was a smaller, more amenable organization, do you see any value in that?
Yeah, huge amounts of value. And if I'm honest, I think you sort of answered the question yourself as well, that if you've got a single point of failure and you can only do a certain level of testing internally, there's huge kind of benefits of that. Not only do you get an opportunity to see how they would respond, how effectively, how quickly, so that there's a level of assurance that you're able to put on top of that is way more than a desktop review could ever do, really. You might have some service level agreements in your contracts that have maybe been agreed years before that actually maybe need to change. And then when you've actually got them in the room and you're chatting to them and they respond, and someone might say, oh yeah, we do that in a couple of days. And then someone will be like, hang on a minute, we said 4 hours. What's that? So you then got a bit of pressure there. So I think in terms of assurance, that's huge. And I think there's also another piece here around that vendor or that supplier has probably got many different contracts with organizations like you as well. You might think that you're going to be top of their list, and you might very much be towards the bottom of their list. So you've got an opportunity then to go, right, 4 hours, what are you doing with everyone else? How are you speaking to them? Why are you just sending us an email when you're picking up the phone to them or whatever? And you just really kind of raise the expectations of, or understand the expectations of, right, we're going to have an email communication, or it's going to be phone call, or it can be face to face. Once you kind of flesh that out with them, I think that's a hugely impactful thing to do. And you've got your relationship manager, you've got your crisis management team with them. They get to know you as people again as well, and also in a bit more of a stressed environment. Typically, you're probably dealing with them on an ongoing basis, maybe in a sales capacity, or a yes, sir, we can do everything for you. Of course we can. We're your supplier. But when it really matters, I think that's a huge opportunity, huge value. You will get pushback. It's not very easy to do. But if you could turn around to the regulators and say, we've actually had third parties in the room with us, you're going to get a massive tick in your box.
Well, okay.
I've got some examples of that.
Sorry, Chris has been very patient and had his hand up to ask a question.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks very much, Tom. I mean, I've just got a few things to sort of pick up on in terms of what you said. I thought it was interesting what you said about the tools piece. Just from recent experience, we've looked at what's going to happen with a massive ransomware attack on our organization if we have to take our networks down. And one of the things that we've now purchased is a separate tool to allow, if you like, our executives and our crisis management team to still communicate outside of our network and independent of it. We purchased this about 6 months ago, trained people on it, or most of them. Most of the execs didn't bother to train, which was a problem. Yeah. So they don't know what's going to happen. But one of the things we identified was the fact that unless we test that tool regularly with the people who are going to have to use it, then it's going to be useless. It could happen today, it could happen, So that regularity of what for us is out-of-band communication methods to ensure the responsiveness and the ability to recover quickly needs to be tested. And the people who are using it, there's only 50 people in our organization that will be using it. It needs to be very familiar to them. So it's that muscle memory with some of these things that you're only going to use in extremis is important, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Other point I thought, I mean, I've used scenario testing in advance of things occurring. So, I mean, my prime example would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I was working for a global organization at that point, myself and my colleague, because we were doing enterprise risk as well as crisis management. You know, we'd already looked at our hotspots and what might occur. We were following what was going on with China, Taiwan. We were following what was going on with Russia, Ukraine. And from the summer before Russia actually invaded in February, we've been tracking things, working up the intelligence, building up our open source intelligence models as well. So that in early January, we went to our executive and said, we need to scenario test because Russia is going to definitely invade. We got pushed away a little bit from that, but then got final agreement to do some scenario testing. And although they pulled the plug on it because the general counsel knew far better than I did, of course, when Russia was going to invade, we actually got the week correct. He pulled it. And so we only did 2 exercises out of 4 that we were preparing to do prior to the invasion. But that, again, stood our organization up in advance of what might happen. A current example would have been in the organization I work for now, which didn't do it, was the change in US administration. You could tell some of the things the new administration might be bringing in that would affect US healthcare. And so again, within my current organization, we could have been scenario testing had they been open to it for some of those changes and what it would mean for our business as well. And so I think that sort of more advanced piece, which I think probably, you know, with operational resilience may well be a better model or more widely followed, certainly has benefits, I think, from the resiliency piece. And that's where some of our ROI, I think, in terms of resilience professionals should be seen within the business, not just that cost center, but actually, you know, you're bringing value in terms of some of that use of advanced intelligence based on your business, what its strategic aims are, where it operates, and you know, the necessary threats that you may see out there, but you may appreciate the velocity of threat coming at your organization better than some other people as well.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. I think people in resilience hold so much knowledge and value, just generally knowing what across the whole business, what's important, and then looking at what could impact the business is hugely informative, and just sometimes doesn't get talked about. And then you're getting pushed back around doing some scenarios of something that's so grave, you know, is a bit of a shame. But you know, you got 2 out of the 4, bit of muscle memory. People have had an opportunity to work with each other in a sort of a simulated stressed environment. It's invaluable. Picking up the plan for the first time is never advisable.
Brilliant. Okay. Any other questions? Comments? Sorry, Hannah,
I'll just mention a couple of things.
Go for it.
I mean, again, picking up on one of your points, Tom, we, having looked at how our teams are functioning, one of the things that I've got planned for later on this year with our enterprise incident command team is using just the alternates. And so we're going to do an alternates only exercise. We've decided that it would be good to get the B team together, if you like, C team in some cases, just to do an exercise with that group to see how they function without the more experienced hands together. And so we'll be kicking that off in the fall here. And just on that third-party testing piece, when I worked in the clinical trials industry before joining the Moors, one of the things we had approaches from 2 of our clients, because we were then, if you like, their third party, was much more an approach of wanting to work with us in making sure that our plans interfaced with theirs. And this was a positive sort of action on behalf of two large pharma companies. I'd left by the time that we got round to actually doing the testing, as I think Mo was talking about, developing that into a test with them as well, so that we could both test our systems. And a part of that was also how we were going to manage emergency communications between the two parties as well, depending on what the scenario was. That was 4 years ago. Fairly innovative approach to us, and much better than just being audited by them every year in terms of what we got in place. And so I thought that was, again, something quite progressive. And in my current role now, where we're looking at third parties in terms of some of our major areas, such as supply chain for medical supplies, is something that we're looking to develop with them moving forward.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that comes back to some of the things that we're also seeing out of the Kelly report into Heathrow outage. That obviously has highlighted again the importance of robust and continuous scenario testing, but also that third party thing about where are the assumptions. And that, I think, is a really important part of what exercises helps us to tease out, because it's implicit. There are always implicit assumptions that we put into any plans and documents that we write, and we may appreciate them, but we probably don't really appreciate them until we do these scenarios. And that's the opportunity to really understand them, break them down, and evaluate what our other options would be.
Yeah, I had two experiences of that. I used to work for the London Fire Brigade and did a lot of multi-agency response there, obviously. But then when I moved into private practice, the one in particular we did with a manufacturing site in Ireland. And I said on a whim, why didn't we invite the fire brigade to the fire incident? They did some kind of on-site familiarization training, but to the desktop exercise. And so the two station managers turned up, the group manager, and it was actually quite eye-opening that the first question they said is, how do you want us to put out the fire? And the site manager was like, well, that's your job. You put out the fire. And they said, we need input from you around hazard locations, what piece of machinery you might want to protect. And we can build our firefighting strategy based on the answer to those questions. So if you tell us where to aim the water, we'll do our best to protect what you might have as a piece of machinery that you can't replace for 18 months. So that to them just changed the complete tone of the exercise. And it went from being quite defensive from the site to, oh, we actually need to think about this. Like how it's not just our own internal reasons, it's to then portray that to the emergency services as well. We did another one with a luxury kind of fashion house, and their warehouse is in South London, managed by a 3PL, and we had a joint exercise between the 3PL and them. And again, it took out that question mark around knowingly, like, what was their intention behind the questions that they were asking. And it was just very open and honest. And there was no kind of, well, why do you want to know what our plan is? Or why do you want to know this? It just created a much more fluid dynamic, to the point where for a fire incident, then a member of the 3PL sits on the crisis management team, because they're that direct link back to the third party. So yeah, I would say, even if it's just for the planning of the scenario to add the realism, but getting them to attend and co-respond is extremely valuable.
Tom, if I could also ask a question, I know in terms of broad structure, there's probably multiple similarities, but can you highlight any key differences in the way a crisis or BCP scenario is enacted or planned for a critical infrastructure, i.e. London Heathrow Airport or nuclear power, national grid, compared to, for example, a bank or an insurance company or even a smaller organisation? What are the key differences that separate the way you approach one over the other? Are there any key things that come to mind, or would you say they're broadly similar? Obviously, the approach is going to be slightly different, but in terms of the structure and the planning, are they broadly similar, or are there key differences in the way they're handled?
I think that definitely key difference in the way they're handled, I think, is sort of scale and impact of something like that. The scenarios you mentioned there, possibly bringing in life safety a little bit more than the banking side. In terms of planning for something like that, it's not about an internal facing issue. It's the volume of industries, companies, regions that might be impacted by it. When we were doing the Bank of England, there's a whole heap of different things, different times of day, times of week that impact it, but it's people trying to access different products, etc. The national grid went down, didn't it, not too long ago, for about 0.1 second or something like that. It had huge impacts across transport, banking, So in terms of building a scenario for it, I think probably spending a little bit more time making it plausible. Severity is probably quite easy to come up with, but the plausibility of national grid going down for half a day, that's probably very unrealistic. But 0.1 of a second, suddenly you could probably, well, you can fathom that because it's happened. But yeah, focusing a bit more time on what is realistic, plausible, therefore means you probably having quite a few more conversations with people internally around maybe what's happened in the past, what they've seen during audits, what are the risk register saying,
Right.
that sort of thing. Because the more severe it is, the potential more challenge you're going to get from people in the room going, would this really happen to us? So you want to make sure you've done the homework.
So I did a lot of multi-agency exercises, particularly nuclear sites across Lancashire. And the biggest difference was because you had lots of different multi-agencies, they all had their own aims and objectives about what they wanted to get out of the exercise as well, which goes back to if you want to do a third party exercise, what are the aims and objectives of a third party and yours? How do they align? And that it was a lot more resource intensive because you basically were doing 10 exercises because you were exercising every single team under one. And then the debrief, again, was very similar because you debriefed as an organisation or as a team, and then you fed back into the main simulation exercise. So, and as Tom said, you could do these over different locations. You might have people in London dialing into conversations that are happening elsewhere, same internationally as well. So understanding the aims and objectives of each, even you could do it for teams as well within your organisation. If you wanted to test communication in one team, or you wanted to throw a deputy into the situation for the first time in another, you can kind of work out that way too.
Really good points again. It's there's so much you can do within this, and I think back to your point, Hannah, that just reminded me. I was looking at something to do with an old exercise, I think, when I was in the NHS, and the complexity with that, because multi-agency, multi-parties, and I just reading the instructions for it almost gave me heart palpitations about how it was all being coordinated and how it's all going to be debriefed. And there is so much around that, which again, back to the slide the first slide you showed, Tom, around that, knowing where your organisation sits based on what your objectives are, or where the team sits in terms of what level of complexity of exercise you want to put in place. I'm conscious that we have run over the time we had for this, and I have another meeting in a few minutes that I need to go to. But thank you, everyone, for a really, really good discussion. I have put links to the podcast that Tom referenced, so you can find it on Spotify or Apple or anywhere else that you get your podcasts. If anyone is interested in coming to the September session of this, I've put a link in there so you can register for that, so you get all the information. Any last questions or comments?
No, just thank you very much for hosting it. Very, very impactful, insightful, and useful. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you, Helen. That's all. So, thank you.
Thank you,
Cheers,
Tom.
all.
Really good. Really appreciate it.
Brilliant.
Cheers, guys.
All right.